Hi there, Why Religion friends. Professor Anthony Sweat here from BYU's Department of Church History and Doctrine. Welcome to another episode of the Why Religion podcast. I want to start off by asking you a question. Off the top of your head, if I were to ask you to think about the most pressing subjects that modern prophets have repeatedly emphasized and even warned about, what subjects would you list? I hope that maintaining religious liberty is on your list and would not be overlooked, because it seems to be a pertinent subject on the minds of church leaders. In fact, the Church Newsroom recently published an article in 2022 titled, quote, 13 times church leaders spoke about religious liberty during the past year, end of quote. Yes, the past year. This emphasis on maintaining the principle of religious freedom is not new, however. After suffering religious oppression in the early days of the church, Joseph Smith often spoke about its necessity and shared broad views that may seem like common values today, but were ahead of its time. For example, when establishing the new city of Nauvoo, Joseph Smith said in a council meeting, quote, "We act upon the broad and liberal principle that all men have equal rights and ought to be respected, and that every man has a privilege of choosing for himself voluntarily his God and what he pleases for his religion," end of quote. He impressed on those in the meeting, quote, "the importance of thrusting from us every spirit of bigotry and intolerance toward a man's religious sentiments, that spirit which has drenched the earth with blood. When a man feels the least temptation to such intolerance, he ought to spurn it from him," end of quote. The Nauvoo City Council shortly passed an ordinance declaring that, quote, "all religious denominations, whatever, shall have free toleration and equal privileges in this city," end of quote. Latter-day Saints are not alone in expressing the need to protect religious freedom, of course. During his September 2015 visit to the United States, as an example, Pope Francis emphasized the importance of religious freedom, saying in front of the White House that, quote, "religious freedom remains one of America's most precious possessions. And as my brothers, the United States bishops, have reminded us, all are called to be vigilant, precisely as good citizens, to preserve and defend that freedom from everything that would threaten or compromise it," end of quote. Dr. Robert Smith, an assistant teaching professor of church history and doctrine at BYU, has dedicated much of his professional life to issues around the law and religious freedom through his time as a practicing lawyer and with the J. Reuben Clark Law School at BYU. He published a seminal 4-volume series on religious organizations and the law, which was recently updated. Dr. Smith has indeed become a leading voice for religious freedom globally, even testifying before Congress on international religious freedom.
And so that's what the fight is today, is to make sure that religious beliefs, even if they are different from many social norms, are still respected, even if people don't agree.
In today's episode, Robert Smith educates and enlightens us on principles related to religious liberty and why we should continue to understand and encourage religious liberty today. This is Why Religion.
Each year, religion professors at Brigham Young University produce hundreds of publications on subjects related to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This podcast brings this research into one place to enlighten the everyday seeker of truth.
Seek learning, even by study and also by faith.
Interviewing the author, we discuss why the study was done, why it matters, and why the professor chooses to be both a scholar and a disciple. This is Why Religion. Research to enlighten your mind.
Recently, Professor Casey Griffiths of BYU Church History and Doctrine sat down with his colleague Robert Smith to discuss his publication, Religious Organizations and the Law, and his work on religious freedom. In part 1, Dr. Smith will discuss why he did this work, and will also touch on why this is such an important issue for the church and its members, including how Joseph Smith was ahead of his time in articulating modern views on religious liberty and pluralism.
So you've got this varied background, accounting, law, and now religious educator. You're just kind of a Renaissance man, I guess we'd say. And the work we're talking about today is kind of unique as well. It's a 4-volume work. It's still being written.
Yes, that's right.
It's called Religious Organizations and the Law, and this isn't exactly something you can pick up at the local Barnes and Noble or something like that. You sent me a portion to read, I think the introduction, which was only 197 pages. So I'm going to be honest and say for the first time in a Why Religion, I have not read the whole work because it's several thousand pages long right now.
That's correct.
Right?
That's correct.
It's published by, who's the publisher?
Thomson Reuters.
Thomson Reuters. And it's definitely a reference work that a person would use.
That's right. It's really for lawyers.
Yeah. Well, tell me a little bit about how this project came into being and what it's intended to do.
Sure. It started years ago with Professor Bassett. He was a Catholic law professor out in San Francisco, and he had spent many years working at the Vatican and had been involved in the Vatican II changes back in the 1960s. And so he was very accomplished as a Catholic lawyer, and he had received a grant from the Lilly Foundation to begin this work because there was no treatise that helped lawyers representing churches. Mm-hmm. And he had taken it pretty far, but then he was getting ready to retire, and he looked for a lot of people. I think he was probably looking for a good Catholic to take it over, but he couldn't find anyone. And so one day he was at a conference sitting next to Cole Durham, and he said, "Cole, would you like to take over my treatise?" Mm-hmm. And Cole said yes, and he came to me and he said, "Bob, guess what we're going to do?" And so we began this work. It's an important work in a couple senses. It's for American lawyers. Mm-hmm. And the churches are pervasive in our country. They're involved with many different activities. They're involved with everything from healthcare to working with schools and education and social services and immigration and besides all of their religious work. And because of the involvement of churches in society, they have to, like any other organization, abide by the laws that govern those areas. But the difference is that churches have special constitutional protections. And so even though a law might be written in a certain way, you have to look at that law and say, does the Constitution give the church a different perspective on this? Can they, in effect, continue to be faithful to their religious tradition and beliefs and therefore be accepted from the law that applies to others? And so this text is really about how that works in all the different aspects of religion in America.
Yeah, in the introduction, one of the things you mentioned is a quote by Alexis de Tocqueville. He said, "There is no country in the whole world in which the Christian religion retains a greater influence over the souls of men than in America." Followed up by a quote from Philip Schaff, who said, "The United States is by far the most religious and Christian country in the world because religion there is most free." So is there a connection between the way religion kind of permeates every part of American society with how free religion is in American society?
Absolutely. If you go back in history to the founding of our country, the founders really wanted to reject the models of Europe in which there was a national religion. Most of the countries of Europe at the time had one religion. It was the religion of the monarch, and everyone was expected to belong to that church. And there was a close relationship between that church and government, and the government would often control their priests and pay them and other things. And so our country rejected that model and said, we're going to not have an established religion, and we're going to allow for different religions. And so we were a unique experiment in the world in having many different religions. Now, in truth, different states had predominant religions and so forth in the early founding days. But that freedom to have different religions fomented great energy and enthusiasm, authentic worship, as opposed to government-mandated or controlled religion. And that's what Alexis de Tocqueville is referencing. And that's also, from our vantage point, one of the great blessings of the Restoration. When you think of Joseph Smith, when he describes the tumult of religion that he was involved with, that's what he's talking about, is that there was an area in New York at that time where there were many preachers trying to excite people about religion. And so that freedom to form a religion, to have a religious community, also fomented enthusiasm and real, authentic belief.
Yeah, it feels like it creates this wonderful marketplace of ideas that Joseph Smith in his writings talks directly about interacting with, that he was free to go from church to church to church. He wasn't funneled into just one system, and that caused him to reflect, think deeply, and then even, well, under the direction of inspiration, start his own religion.
That's exactly right.
That conformed with what God was telling him.
Exactly. And we, in a general sense, pay homage to those founders who understood the need for religious freedom to foster religion. They weren't against religion. In many senses, they were for it, but they just weren't going to prescribe what that religion would be. And we're, of course, the beneficiaries with the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. We had many problems, obviously, and we often talk about the persecutions that our members suffered. But it couldn't have happened anywhere else in the world because there was no other country at the time that actually allowed for different religious communities to coexist.
And it feels like the irony is that where there were state religions, it was intended to protect the religion, right? But in America, where we didn't have a state religion, it seems like it was the thing that really encouraged this country becoming so religious, because there weren't any pressures to force a person to believe one way or the other. It caused this explosion in free thinking and ideas and new approaches towards religion. I mean, obviously, our religion is what we feel is the true one, but there's been so many other interesting developments in religion in the United States, and that environment of religious freedom really was kind of the pressure cooker that caused all these great ideas to explode, for lack of a better analogy.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. That's a great analogy. And in many senses, the greatest export of the United States is religious freedom. This isn't just a casual thought. This was an explosive revolution to think that you could have a country where not everyone was of the same faith. The idea historically was that the way to have unity was if we are all part of the same religion. And that way the church can kind of control our thoughts or at least try to shepherd our thoughts in a certain direction. But as you pointed out, the irony of that is that when you force people and don't give them a choice, you're stifling authentic belief. And that's the difference. And, obviously there's probably a wide variety of opinions on this, but my sense is that where you have state religions in Western Europe now, the participation is de minimis. People they feel like it's a part of the government. Mm-hmm. And obviously people appreciate the government, but they don't necessarily have faith in it in the same way that we have faith in the Lord Jesus Christ.
Right.
And so if it's the government that's telling you who the pastors are and sort of conditioning what the doctrine is, you're just not going to get authentic belief.
So a robust religious freedom encourages authentic religious belief.
Exactly.
So there's a lot of talk today about defining religious freedom. In fact, I've noticed that that's a large part of this introduction is what is religion, what is religious freedom, how does it qualify, and why it's important. Give us kind of a brief explanation of religious freedom, what it is, why it matters.
Yeah, this is complicated in some sense. When we talk about religious freedom, often we're concerned that a religious group or body can exercise that religion. They can practice that religion without fear of negative repercussions. And so at the most basic level, we're concerned that believers can worship how, where, or what they may, as Joseph Smith put it. And that's bedrock in terms of religious freedom. When in many societies today, including ours, that is taken for granted a little bit. It's a given in some senses, and the ramifications are not so drastic as you'll be imprisoned or you'll be have to leave the city or something like that, which obviously occurred a few hundred years ago. But today, when we talk about religious freedom, we're talking about there's lots of things, but we're avoiding problems socially and in our jobs and in our political life that can occur if you're viewed as an outcast socially, because of your religious beliefs. There was a really great talk at a conference a few years ago by Alexander Dushku where he said, we really have two roads to take. There, on the one hand, you have the example of racial discrimination. And while people are free to feel negative racial feelings, you're a social outcast. You could never be president of the United States if you had deep racial prejudice. And on the other hand, you have the example of the abortion debate, where we have presidents who are on different sides of that issue. And so there's this feeling that even though there might be deep feelings on both sides of the issue, there's also a respect that it's okay for someone to have a different opinion. I mean, that's a legitimate part of society. The same analogy occurs in religion. If people think of religion as being like the abortion debate, we may not agree, but we respect you for what your beliefs are. Mm-hmm. That's what we aspire to in religious freedom today, as opposed to the other model. You're religious, therefore you're a bigot. You can't be part of our social society. And so that's what the fight is today, is to make sure that religious beliefs, even if they are different from many social norms, are still respected, even if people don't agree.
And a lot of this, you're making me think of some of the language in section 134 of the Doctrine and Covenants that talks about the rights of religious societies and what they can do and what we believe they shouldn't do. I think Joseph Smith also talked at length about religious pluralism. The Council of 50 Minutes were published in 2015. And as I read through them, I was really surprised that Joseph Smith was talking about how everyone's religious opinions ought to be protected, that they need to be led by the hand if they're wrong, but that a person shouldn't be discriminated against based on their beliefs.
We can be so proud of Joseph Smith and his inspired declarations about religious freedom. They bring tears to my eyes. He expressed the feeling that he would give his life for persons of other faiths to practice their faith. When you have that kind of feeling about religious freedom, you're a real believer. And Joseph Smith taught that principle, and that was one of the profound lessons that he learned through the persecutions of the saints. And one of the reasons he ran for president of the United States was because he recognized that at that time, the constitutional protection that we think of in the first, in the amendments to the Constitution, were only applied to the federal government and not to the states. Mm-hmm. he recognized that particularly through the persecutions in Missouri, that when the president of the country said, "Your cause is just, but I can do nothing for you," in part he was saying the laws don't allow us to reach into the state of Missouri. You have freedom of religion in the sense of the federal laws, but not in the state. And so he was declaring not just his apathy, but also the limitations that exist in the law. And so Joseph Smith wanted to correct that.
Mm-hmm.
And he recognized that our Constitution needed to be applied to state laws as well because of the persecutions we'd suffered. So Joseph Smith is he's our hero for religious freedom, and he stated it so well in so many different occasions.
Since I've been able to pull up the quote here that I was thinking of, it's from the Council of 50 Minutes, April 11th, 1844. God cannot save or damn a man only on the principle that every man acts, chooses, and worships for himself. Hence the importance of thrusting from us every spirit of bigotry and intolerance towards a man's religious sentiments, the spirit which has drenched the earth with blood. When a man feels the least temptation to such intolerance, he ought to spurn it from him. Hence, in all governments or political transactions, a man's religious opinion should never be called into question. A man should be judged by the law, independent of religious prejudice.
Yeah.
Good stuff.
It's remarkable and so inspired. And those principles that he enunciated were perhaps ahead of their time for many people, but they've come to become the gold standard of what we aspire to today. And so when we talk about religious freedom, in many senses, we're just trying to catch up with Joseph Smith and his vision.
If you're interested in more peer-reviewed, high-quality gospel scholarship about Latter-day Saint history, doctrine, or practice, such as this publication, BYU's Religious Studies Center is a great place to check out. The RSC has recently published a new book called Home-Centered Gospel Learning and Living, Seeking Greater Personal Revelation, by Lauren Marks and David Dolehite. In discussing home-centered worship, this volume explores both individual and family worship and draws reports from a diverse sample of more than 500 Latter-day Saints who have shared challenges and barriers that they have faced, as well as the successes they have experienced. Using these real-life experiences, quotes, and key findings from the social sciences, this book can help individuals and families establish and maintain a home-centered religious life and strengthen their conversion to the gospel. Again, the book is called Home-Centered Gospel Learning and Living, Seeking Greater Personal Revelation. Check it out and pick it up at rsc.byu.edu. We've been listening to Robert Smith from BYU Church History and Doctrine discuss concepts related to religious liberty and the law from his multi-year legal volumes that he has co-published. In part 2 of Why Religion, we like to explore a little bit about why this research matters. How can it inform us in helping us to live, learn, or love aspects of the restored gospel of Jesus Christ? In this part, Professor Smith discusses how religious freedom encompasses moral goals and priorities, and how we should be able to publicly share and speak about them. He will also touch on some of the challenges to living in areas where there is a high and low density population of Latter-day Saints, along with some of the things that Latter-day Saints can do to encourage religious liberty for all.
So in all this discussion of religious freedom, I think a lot of people understand why it's important, but there's a feel of what do I do about it? How can I be involved? What would you point a person towards to say, here's what you can do to help out with this?
That's a great question, and it's not an easy one. But one of the keys that helped me was in many of the prophets and apostles have spoken on religious freedom in a variety of contexts and different venues, and they've really spoken about this a lot. But one of the keys that helped me is in one of the recent talks, the idea was equated between religious freedom and morality. And in other words, if you have a moral opinion grounded in religious belief, you shouldn't be shut off from the public square because your opinion is grounded in religion. It may be a moral opinion. It may not have to do with whether you can go to church on Sunday or whether you can belong to a certain faith, but it's because of your religious beliefs, you feel this moral imperative. And when you start to think of it that way, religious freedom then encompasses moral goals and priorities that we have. So let me give you an example. This last school year, my wife and I would drop our son off for high school every day. And we began to notice that the students would come to school and they weren't abiding by what was the published dress code. And it was, we'd been gone for 3 years, and then we'd come back and we'd notice it was quite a bit different. And now modesty in dress is perhaps grounded in our religious faith. Mm-hmm. We think that's important, that we dress modestly. And so my wife began to talk with the leaders of the school and say, you're not enforcing your dress code. And her efforts to propose that the dress code be followed and so forth were really grounded in her religious beliefs and her morality. That's an example of how those things come together with religious freedom. If they had said to her, we don't want to hear about your modesty ideas because they're grounded in your religious faith, that would have been shunning her because of that, her faith. But they didn't. They listened to her, and it's a long story, but they basically said, your cause is just, but we're not sure if we can do anything for you. But in time, I'll just tell you the conclusion. She talked to the principal. They told her to go to the principal told her to go to the school board. The school board said that's something that the principals do. So they told her to go back to the principal. And then they told her to go to the parent teacher organization, and it went around for a while. But they gave her a voice. And in the end, the school board and the administration of the high school came together and said, we do want to have a dress code. And here it is. And they sent it to all the parents and so forth. And so it was a successful effort. But to me, that's an example of what modern religious freedom looks like. It's not being ashamed that your desires or your beliefs are grounded in your religious faith, and you can speak up and talk about them.
Yeah, as you were talking, this quote from Dallin H. Oaks came to mind. I'm going to read. He said, believers should not be deterred by the familiar charge that they're trying to legislate morality. Many areas of the law are based on Judeo-Christian morality and have been for centuries. Our civilization is based on morality and cannot exist without it. As John Adams declared, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It's wholly inadequate to the government of any other. And so let's say there's a PTA meeting where they're discussing the dress code. Is it appropriate for a person to stand up and say, my religious beliefs lead me to believe that a dress code is important, as long as they address the other reasons why the dress code's important too, that apply to everybody that's there? Would that be an appropriate example?
Absolutely. The point is, all of us have opinions, and those opinions are grounded in some kind of background and experience. And every background and experience is legitimate for purposes of public discussion. And so you can't say to somebody, well, your opinion comes from your religious belief, therefore we're going to disregard it as being irrelevant or inappropriate. But your belief is grounded in your science or your academic training, and therefore it's legitimate. Or somehow try to say secular ideas are okay, but religious or moral ideas are not. We're humans, and we have a spiritual nature, and we do care about morals and ethics and the things that hold our society together, the trust that we hold dear. And so it's completely appropriate to both state your opinion and the basis for that opinion. And so that's one of the challenges of today, candidly, is that there have been efforts in recent years to delegitimize opinions if they come from religion.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the big risks we have today. And I think the quote you just read and other general authorities have spoken very expressly on the importance of speaking out based on our religious convictions and not hiding it.
Not having, and that goes for other religious traditions
Absolutely.
too, right? If that PTA meeting has a Muslim that wants to stand up and talk about how modesty relates to their tradition, that should be appropriate.
Totally appropriate. Absolutely. And one of the great things you were talking about Joseph Smith earlier is he inculcated in us this respect for others as well, this deep respect. I just have to say, years ago, Professor Durham works with a lot of scholars all around the world, but one scholar was particularly interested in understanding what was motivating Cole, what was really at the heart of our religion on this. And so he came out to BYU to study this issue. And, after being here and studying, he said, "You really believe this, don't you? This is something deep in your DNA as a religion." And this, in our best selves, we welcome all beliefs, and we listen and we respond in a respectful way. And President Oakes, for example, has talked quite a bit about the importance of civility and respect for others.
Yeah, from the same talk about President Oakes, when believers seek to promote their positions in the public square, their methods and their advocacy should always be tolerant of the opinions and positions of others who do not share their beliefs. We should not add to the extremism that divides our society. As believers, we must always speak with love and show patience, understanding, and compassion towards our adversaries.
Exactly. That's the spirit and of religious freedom, really. And part of religious freedom is also respecting those who choose not to believe. And so obviously we have a society in which there are many who are outspoken about their lack of belief in God. But that part of religious freedom dictates that we respect them as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I do an experiment with my classes when we talk about this. Many of our students here at BYU come from areas where there are not large numbers of church members, and a lot of them come from areas where there are a lot of church members. And I ask the question, do you think it's easier to be a believing Latter-day Saint where there's not a lot of us or where there are a lot of us? And what are the challenges unique to each environment? How would you answer that question? What are the challenges in areas where Latter-day Saints are majority, and what are the challenges in where Latter-day Saints are the minority?
That's a very interesting question. I don't know that I have the all-encompassing answer, but I have had the experience of growing up in Southern California and then living much of my life, as I said, in areas outside of Utah. We've lived in Utah for a little over 20 years, but I've lived in other places for many more. I would say the challenges that exist in living in our society here in Utah are that many people are rightly concerned about offending others. And because the church has had a predominant place in society and a majority throughout much of the history of Utah, there's a concern to not overdo that advantage, if you will, or to press that point. And so members, I think, genuinely and sincerely want to be considerate of others and their feelings and not make them feel like they're in a hostile environment. Mm-hmm. And I think that's part of the following Joseph Smith and what he was saying. But if you think of it like a pendulum, you can go too far, and you can be so concerned about others' feelings that you hide the fact that you have any religious sentiments. Just to give you an example, this last year I was talking to my son, again, my high school son, who was with different friends, and on one occasion I asked him, if one of his friends was a member of the church. And he said he didn't know. And I thought how odd that is, that you could be with somebody so frequently and not even know about somebody's religious belief. And I began to ask more questions. And what I learned, because I didn't go to high school in Utah, is that pretty much they don't talk about religion. It's kind of this sense of it's a religion-free zone, and we aren't going to talk about it. And that, to me, is a challenge. The pendulum has swung too far, and that members of the church should be authentic in their belief. They don't need to hide their religious convictions. So I would say, in terms of living here, the challenge is to be considerate of others, but not hide what we really authentically believe. On the other hand, when you live in a different part of the country, the most, in my experience, if you're a faithful member of the church, people know that, and so you're that can be a really positive thing because people look to you and they're watching you, and you know that, and so you're on guard to be appropriate in your actions and to be a good example of a believer. I think the challenges, in my experience, were pretty minimal. In my experience, people were mostly respectful of religious belief. So, for example, if I had a work assignment or something, and I wanted to avoid working on the Sabbath, and I expressed that, people were very respectful. But you know, things can change, and you can obviously have exceptions to that. But my experience was actually positive.
Mm. Well, you've lived in a lot of different environments, and you've studied this more deeply than probably any of us will. What are some other things that Latter-day Saints can do to encourage this robust religious freedom that we're discussing?
Well, that's a great question. I wanted to share just a little portion of a talk that was given at BYU by Elder Rasband. This was a talk that he gave a number of years ago. It was called Religious Freedom and Fairness for All. It was given in September of 2015. And, you know, he just spoke on religious freedom in General Conference just last April. And so this has been a topic that he's thought some about. But in this talk, he said, he's speaking to young people, but he said, we need you to engage in dialogue regarding the complexities of this issue, speaking of religious freedom, and find solutions for how to best extend fairness to everyone, including people of faith. And I just paused to note that we need to be fair to those that are non-believers, but we also need to be fair to the believers and respect their right to have religious convictions. These conversations need to be occurring in our schools, perhaps right here at Brigham Young University, in our homes, and in our relationships with friends and coworkers. Now, I think that's an important beginning to how we address religious freedoms. We need to begin to talk about it, and just like we're doing today, but as he points out, with people all around us, and to begin to talk about these relationships we have and our faith and how that relates to our views and public views and other things. And he says, when you have these conversations, please remember the principles we've discussed today, which are simply these: see others through a lens of fairness, treat them with respect and kindness, and expect the same treatment in return. He goes on to encourage people to share their experiences with him, and he really was issuing a call to action to the young people. And there have been others of the general authorities who have been very explicit about, we need you young people to really engage in this and figure out how we can have religious freedom in our society, the freedom to believe and not be looked down upon for those beliefs.
If you're interested in reading Professor Robert Smith's work on religious organizations and the law, we've included a link to that 4-volume series on our website. But let's be honest, since most of you are not going to read a legal treatise meant for lawyers about religious liberty, on our website at whyreligion.byu.edu, we've also included a link to the church's 2022 newsroom article that I mentioned, titled 13 Times Church Leaders Spoke About Religious Liberty During the Past Year. We'd encourage you to read that article also and check out the teachings from modern prophets and church leaders on this important subject. Okay, we've arrived at our last segment, part 3 of Why Religion, where we like to discuss things a little bit more personal with the professor. In this part, Dr. Robert Smith tells us about his educational background and experience and his journey that brought him to BYU, as well as why he chooses to be a man of faith and believe in his mind and in his heart about the restored gospel of Jesus Christ.
Well, let's take a minute and talk about you then. And one of the reasons we started this podcast is because we wanted to bring on intelligent people that are also believing people. And can you tell us a little bit about your journey of faith?
Well, I'm fairly new to religious education. I've been here for 3 years. I served a mission with my wife in Argentina, and coming back from the mission, we had the chance to go back to the law school where I'd spent the prior 10 years as the managing director of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies. And in that capacity, I helped organize conferences that generally dealt with religious freedom issues around the world. And it was a wonderful experience and life-changing in many respects. But when I came back, it seemed like a good time to make a transition. I could have gone back, but I felt that I wanted to teach some of the principles I'd learned to a broader audience of students, of undergraduate students. Mm-hmm. And so I talked with the dean at the time, Dean Judd, and he was supportive. And so I came here, and that's what I'm working on now.
And tell us a little bit about your professional background, what you did before you were mission president, and what it involved.
Well, I have a strange background in that regard. I'm an attorney. I'll just give you the story. I was originally an accountant, and I was involved with accounting in California, and I felt like I needed to advance my education, so I went to the University of Notre Dame and got an MBA, but emphasized taxation. And so I returned to an accounting firm and did tax work in Washington, D.C., and I was surrounded by attorneys. And one day I was talking to a friend, and he's a good friend of mine, who said, "Bob, why don't you come with me to law school?" And we talked for a while, and I got off the phone, and I told my wife, "Honey, how'd you like to go to law school?" And she said, "No." But we prayed about it, and we felt like we should go. So we ended up coming to BYU again for law school. And then there's a lot of details, but I ended up practicing in Chicago for a big law firm, and then in Washington, D.C. in the tax field. And then got a call one day asking if I might consider helping the Church of Jesus Christ with its tax work. And so after several months of considering that, we ended up coming to Washington, D.C., and that's been a little over 20 years ago. So I spent a number of years representing the church in a number of tax matters. And there's some more details, but I eventually came to the law school where I was the managing director of the center.
Along the way, what have you learned that's helped you reconcile your faith and your reason?
Well, all of us are intelligent, and we all have to recognize that we're on a spiritual journey in life. My spiritual journey began when I was a young man. I had a bishop this is in Southern California, who really understood the importance of engaging and sharing our faith with others. And we, in those days, they had what they called 2-week missions, where the priests could, young men who were 16 and older, could go out and live with the missionaries for 2 weeks and work with them. And so he wanted all of us to do that. And we prepared for essentially a year for that enterprise. And so our discussions in church were about that. Our preparations and our weekday activities, we often would go to the visitor center in Los Angeles at the temple and other things. We were preparing to be missionaries. When we were done with that 2-week experience, it was a very impactful one for me and for others. 2 of the young men that were involved were so enthusiastic about sharing the gospel that they took it upon themselves to go to other churches, and they would go to the pastor and they would ask if they could have permission to speak in front of the congregation and invite them to join our church. And the climax, one of them was the bishop's son, our bishop's son, and he had a big bright yellow van with a red stripe. And the climax occurred when he parked that van, my friend, right in front of the Pentecostal church, which was next to ours. And everybody who came to church that day on Sunday saw the bishop's van in front of the Pentecostal church and wondered what was going on. Well, it was his son trying to convert the Pentecostal congregation. So the bishop said, let's use this enthusiasm in a way that will really be productive. And so he organized us into a missionary group. And I was one of the 5 young men chosen, set apart to missionaries, ward missionaries. We had 5 young women. And that began a serious part of my spiritual journey of sharing the gospel with friends at high school. And there's many stories, but that young man, the bishop's son, he baptized more people as a priest than he did on his full-time mission. And during my youth, this wasn't just the group of missionaries, but there were over 20 young people that joined the church in our ward. So just imagine the impact that had to have so many new converts and everybody participating in their fellowship and their conversion. It was a very meaningful and delightful time. And that inculcated in me the opportunity to share my faith with others, to go to the Lord in prayer and ask for direction and confirmation of things that I had been taught, because I was talking to people about it. And then I would realize my faith wasn't necessarily as strong as it needed to be. And so I would study it and pray about it. And that was really the beginning of my spiritual journey. And I've just had a strong conversion as a young man. And I've just been enthusiastic about the gospel ever since.
So these conversations were what kind of drove you forward, which is so important because it feels like there's an alarming lack of conversation today. You post an anonymous comment online and you make it as sarcastic and snarky as you can, and then there's no reply. There's no response back and forth.
Well, there can be replies, but they can be
equally
snarky too.
Snarky and sarcastic as well. Yeah. How do you still have these conversations with people? How do you engage people about the gospel and talk to them about it?
All the time. Now we're in Utah, and I'll share the example of my wife. She always carries a copy of the Book of Mormon in her purse. And she takes advantage of little moments that she has with people. And, like she's at a checkout stand at a supermarket or something like that. And, you have a 2 or 3 minute window. And rather than just talk about the weather, she will say, just very matter-of-factly, but normally she'll say, "Hi, have you ever read the Book of Mormon?" to the cashier. And these are great conversations that begin. that begins a wonderful conversation. And some say, no, I've never heard of it, and I'm not interested. And others say, yes, I'm a faithful believer. But the most say something in between. And they say, no, or I did when I was young, or I've read a little bit, but it's been a while, and tell me more. And so they begin this conversation, and often she gives them a copy of the Book of Mormon and encourages them to begin an exploration of its teachings. Many, and there have been great experiences. Just a few months ago, she went to the dry cleaner, and it was just a drive-through thing where you drop off stuff, but she asked the young lady helping her the same question. Have you ever read the book? And she said, no, but it's on my to-do list. I've moved here 8 months ago, I think, from Maryland, she said. Mm-hmm. And so she gave her the copy of the book and got her number, and she's an active member of the church today and doing really well. So conversations can come up all the time, but we have to overcome the idea that it's somehow illegitimate in Utah to raise that. Mm-hmm. We really can let people know, not hide our light under a bushel, so to speak.
Well, and a wonderful thing about everything you've been saying is it feels like a lot of your philosophy rests on the belief that people are basically good. That if we show respect towards people, they'll show respect towards us. If we share what's important with people, they won't sully that. They won't break it down. Basically, they'll listen to what we have to say if we show respect and when we speak with them.
Sure, I mean, our church teaches and our missionaries are taught to be very kind and respectful. They don't denigrate other faiths, and they don't put people down. Obviously, we don't always receive the same respect in return. But, you just go on, and you have to recognize that we don't understand their background, and we don't understand the feelings that they're having precisely. And so you just forgive and forget and move on. But my experience overwhelmingly is very positive. Even if people aren't interested, they're respectful. Mm-hmm. And, there's a few exceptions, but by and large, we shouldn't be afraid or intimidated to talk to anybody.
I was going to say, one of the things that caused me to be most interested in religions and to want to study them was my missionary service. Having all these conversations with people from different faiths, most of whom didn't join the church, but I learned a little bit about what they believe. I remember a Muslim man pulling out, he gave me a copy of the Quran. I traded him a Book of Mormon for a Quran. And he said, before you read this, you should take it very seriously. Wash your hands and wash your face. And the respect that he had for his scriptures caused me to realize that I maybe wasn't showing the reverence and respect that I needed to for my scriptures.
Right.
That's an exchange I still think about almost every day.
Well, you'll notice the church leaders have engaged in a lot of activities where they join hands, so to speak, with faith leaders in variety of different contexts. There was just a few months ago an important event with Muslim believers here at BYU, for example, and we often work in unity with the Catholic Church, for example, and you remember famously President Nelson meeting with the Pope and so forth. And so there is an imperative that we have to join together with others of faith if we're going to uphold the principle of religious freedom.
Thank you for listening to Why Religion. This podcast is a production of Religious Education at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. My name is Anthony Sweat, the host and producer. The Why Religion podcast team also includes from BYU Religious Education Professors Brad Wilcox, Casey Griffiths, Ryan Sharp, and Hank Smith. Recording, mixing, and original music was done by BYU student Mitchell Bashford. Say hi, Mitchell.
Hey, guys.
Original music and scoring for Why Religion podcast was also created by the fabulous BYU student musicians Grant Cagle,
Sam Clausen,
Colette Jones,
and Alistair Scheuermann.
If you enjoy what you've heard, please like and subscribe to Why Religion on wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a rating. It really helps. And join us next time as we continue to bring the everyday Latter-day Saint fascinating gospel studies done by Brigham Young University religion professors to enlighten your mind and strengthen your faith.